It's very crazy. They had a winter storm, and what that winter storm entailed was an inch of snow that did not collect on the roads, but everything shut down. And so my airline flight just kept getting delayed, delayed, delayed. But I finally made it back late Saturday. But I thought, wow, that would be a normal hour in Michigan, right? This inch of snow, but pretty amazing. So anyway, I'm back, and I hope you guys are all doing well. I want to start off. I want to look at page 201. We're going to do something a little bit different from what I had kind of indicated we were going to do. I had asked you guys, or at least my wife had asked you, to look over the readings we have on the Constitution, and I want to delay that just a little bit because I want to do something in between the Declaration and the Constitution. That is, I want to talk about George Washington and his role in the American founding. Washington is an absolutely critical figure in every way. He is the critical figure of the American Revolution. And nothing would have worked the way that it did without George Washington being there and really directing all things. So if you look at page 201, in the middle of his first inaugural, he says this amazing, beautiful statement. It's that full paragraph, that first full paragraph on that page. I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. Now, let's just analyze that for a moment. Let's think about what Washington is saying here. You guys have to go back to your Western heritage for a moment to get some of the terminology. Think about the idea of the economy and course of nature. That was a very, very medieval way of thinking, and that comes specifically from the Middle Ages. That's a very medieval way of thinking about how God distributes his grace according to his will and not our will. So when we talk about the economy and the course of nature, economy here doesn't mean barter and trade. It means the community. That's what economy originally meant, the community of the people. And so we're looking specifically at how God grants his blessings. And Washington was a devout Anglican, a devout member of the Church of England. He was a vestryman in his own church, so he had a high position within his church. And he was pretty orthodox overall in his Christianity. So when he starts invoking God, this is not just the rhetoric of the age. This really is his deeply held belief. And notice what he says here, and I think this is critical, that there can be no rights without corresponding duties. And so again, imagine back to your Western Heritage class, think back specifically to Cicero. Cicero said that all philosophers are most concerned with our duties, not our rights. They're concerned with our duties. That is, how do we discharge the gifts that have been given to us for the res publica, for the common good, for the republic? How do we do that? And that's what Washington is asking. But he's reminding us that every advantage we have in society is a gift. Right? This is not something we should be selfish about. This is something we should be selfless about as we look at our various communities. So we want honesty, we want magnanimity. That is, we want to be generous in the way that we think about these things. But then look at the second part of that statement, which we haven't read yet. Since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained. So there we find a kind of threat and yet a caution in what Washington is saying. If we don't follow the natural law, if we don't follow God's rules, Well, in no way should we expect God's blessings. That's an absurdity in every way, that we would expect him to smile, especially with propitious smiles. We would never expect that, because we know that we haven't lived up to what we owe him. So think about what he had just said. On an individual level, we have no rights without a corresponding duty. So if I have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it means I have the duty to give to my community. If God gives me his grace, I have the duty to return my gifts for his use. So it's always reciprocated in some way. And that's where the nation comes down. And I want you guys to be a little bit careful about this. Really, only Washington can get away with saying something like nation. Nation was a deeply loaded word at the time of the American founding. And nation was something that most Americans would have rejected completely. They would have called us a republic, they would have called us a union. But the idea of a nation, that just rubbed people the wrong way, because it seemed too centralized, it seemed too powerful. But Washington can get away with it because he's Washington. But notice in American discourse, and we'll see this throughout this semester, nobody will use the term nation again until Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So nation will just go out of favor as a word as soon as Washington is out of office, and no one uses it again until 1863 when Lincoln does. So that's going to be a really important part of our story this semester, why we don't believe in a nation. A republic, remember, is always decentralizing. A nation is always centralizing. So it's I would say this, and I don't think I'm being outrageous about this, but I think it's pretty near impossible to have both a republic and a nation. I don't think those two things play well together at all. So we can have one or the other, but we really can't have both at the same time. And then notice what Washington says. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered, deeply, perhaps finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. So we've not had a serious republic since Rome fell in 43 BC. We have not had a serious republic since Cicero was executed. The world has not seen them. Now we Americans have laid claim to a republic, and that means that we have the glorious burden of proving its reality, of proving its efficacy, of proving its actual worth in the world. And so that means, and I still believe this, I believe this firmly in 2026 as much as Washington believed it here in 1789, every one of us in this room was born into a republic. That means that we have certain things we owe our government that if we lived in a monarchy, we wouldn't owe. Or if we lived in an aristocracy, we wouldn't owe. Or a democracy, we wouldn't owe. But we're born into a republic. And a republic both gives and demands of its citizens. And I thank God that we were born in a republic. I think it's the greatest possible entity that we could be born into. But it is very, very demanding. It's more demanding than any other government by far, but than any other society, because it means that many of us, not all, but many of us have to give ourselves over to the common good for it to work. So that's why it's always so fragile in how we think about it and what it means. Okay, then let's just turn forward a little bit to George Washington in his argument in his farewell address. And it starts on page 215. And I'm going to just lecture very, very briefly about this rather than us actually read from it. Washington's farewell address is considered, and I don't think anyone would dispute this, Washington's farewell address is considered the greatest farewell address given in American history. And there are reasons for that. And part of it's just beautifully written. Washington, interestingly enough, he doesn't have quite the pen that, say, Thomas Jefferson did, but nobody does. I mean, nobody's going to live up to Jefferson, right? Jefferson is just extraordinary in his writing. And I think because we have men like Adams and we have men like Jefferson, we often think of Washington as kind of a second-rank man when it comes to intelligence because he wasn't at the level of Jefferson or Adams. But that's totally unfair. Every one of us in this room would look second rank if we were put up next to Thomas Jefferson or John Adams. They're extraordinary. But that really shouldn't be used to diminish George Washington. Washington was a brilliant man, not liberally educated. He was actually educated in engineering, mathematics, and surveying. So what we would now call STEM was what he did. He wasn't liberally educated, but he had a thorough understanding of the liberal arts because he was absolutely obsessed. In fact, he had it memorized with a play from the 17 teens called Cato, a Tragedy. And in that play, and I want you guys to know this, right? It's a very important play. It's the most important play of this century. But Cato, a Tragedy is the story of Cato the Younger. If you guys remember back to Western Heritage, you had to read Cato the Elder. Cato the Younger is his grandson. And Cato the Younger is the last Roman Republican to fight against Julius Caesar. That is, he has Republican forces, and he's trying to stop Julius Caesar from taking over the Republic. And Cato fails. He's defeated, even though he has a relatively stable army, mostly of North Africans who are in his army. And in particular, a guy named Juba, J-U-B-A, is his second in command, a black African. And that'll be important to the story here in a moment. Washington then learned most of his classics from memorizing this play, Cato, a Tragedy, which was a classical play, a classic play, written by a guy named Joseph Addison at the very beginning of the 18th century. And what Addison was trying to do was remind the British people, because it's a British play, he was trying to remind them that there are circumstances in which it is better to lose, but to lose virtuously, than to die, or than to win unvirtuously. And what happens with Cato the Younger is he is defeated by Caesar, but rather than being taken alive by Caesar, he's a Stoic. He's a serious, serious Stoic. And so rather than being taken alive by Caesar, he commits suicide because he believes that's the honorable way out of all of this. And that was a part, it's a disturbing, but that's a part of Stoicism, that suicide could be an honorable exit from this world. And so what happens is George Washington not only loves this play, but he often, when he writes letters, he signs his name Juba. And I just talk about that for a moment, because remember, Juba is the black African. And there's this, before Cato is dead, there's this incredible moment where Juba goes up, and you can imagine this is a play. It's a stage play. It's a true story, too, but it's a stage play. And Juba goes up to Cato, and he says, "I am sorry that I was never worthy of you." And Cato looks at Juba, his second in command, and says, "Juba, what are you talking about? How could you not be worthy of me?" And Juba says, "Well, look at me. I'm a Numidian. I'm an African. I'm not a Roman." And Cato looks totally past Juba's skin color and says to him, "No, Juba, of all the men I know, you have the greatest Roman soul." And it's this powerful, powerful moment that I think is so central to republicanism and the idea of a republic, that we really don't care about skin color. We care about character. We care about the content of a person's soul, not the color of their skin. And that is powerful, because think about George Washington. In his letters, he called himself Juba. And during the winter at Valley Forge, Washington had Cato, a Tragedy, performed 7 times during the winter at Valley Forge. So you can imagine all these Revolutionary War soldiers watching this play in which a black African is the hero and takes over the Republican forces after Cato's dead. That's astounding to think about that and the complications of race and what that means. But think of the other great piece of literature from that era, later, written 100 years later, but Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Last of the Mohicans is also a Republican piece of literature. And in the story, the hero is not Natty Bumppo, who should have been the hero, Leatherstocking, right? But it is, in fact, Cora, who's a black African woman. She's the hero of the story. And that's incredible to think about that from the literature of that age. And you guys, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be politically correct or woke or anything like that. It's just a fact that when we look back at this Republican literature, it recognized that our contribution to the Republic had absolutely nothing to do with our appearance, and it had everything to do with our integrity. And I find that beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So there's Washington. And so what does Washington say in his farewell address? Again, the most famous farewell address in American history. He says, we must be careful as Americans of three things. And these three things we should avoid like the devil. In every way possible, we just run from these three things. And they're very depressing because you can imagine where we're at in 2026. So number one, never have a high debt at all. Right? Never get into debt, and especially not government debt at all. So don't have a high debt. Number two, never, under any circumstances, create political parties. Do not allow political parties to come, because if you do, you will automatically divide the Republic, not by those who believe in the Republic and those who don't, but those who believe in their party before they believe in the Republic. And by its very nature, a republic cannot have political parties, because we must believe in the common good, not in the good of our party. And so a party is automatically the most divisive thing possible in a republic. And finally, number three, never, under any circumstances, create any kind of entangling alliances with foreign powers. Never. So never create a treaty with another power unless it deals with commerce. As Washington said, we should trade with everyone, but we should have alliances with no one. So I ask us to think about that. Here we are in 2026. Let's just analyze where we are. We're about $39 trillion in debt, right? It's a number beyond the comprehension of any of us in this room, and I see absolutely no way of getting out of it. We have two very powerful political parties that hate one another in a very Manichaean fashion, to the point where they don't even talk to one another. They just talk at and past one another. And think about this. We're in this alliance with the Europeans that if the Russians ever attack any one of the member countries of that alliance, we are automatically at war with the Russians. Now, we can debate, all of us in this room, whether those things are individually good or bad, but it's very clear we don't live under a Washingtonian republic anymore. That, I think we can say with absolute certainty, that is gone. And so that makes us then, and I want us to think about these things. And, I'm not going to be anti-NATO in here. Yeah, NATO is such an interesting thing, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, our agreement with Europe. NATO is such an interesting thing because I think it's unconstitutional, because it does say that if one power goes to war against another, we're automatically at war with them. Article 1 of the Constitution says very clearly only Congress can declare that, not another country. So I don't actually think NATO is constitutional, but I do think it's been very beneficial in the world. So I'm not, don't get me wrong, guys, I'm not trying to diss it or just dismiss it, but I do think that there are complications with it overall, and we'll see those as we get to them. And I think that George Washington's warning is a legitimate warning. Okay, do you guys have questions about any of that, about what Washington was saying, and anything dealing with Cato or? Okay, well, yeah, please. Is it Colson? No, I'm sorry, Colton. What is it?
Gabe.
Gabe. Gosh, I wasn't even close. Man. Okay, Gabe, go ahead.
Weren't there already, to some extent, political parties? Maybe not in the sense we have them now, but they were Federalists.
That's a very good question. Yeah, the very first political, they weren't political parties, they were movements. And they were on the verge of becoming political parties. But the very first political party we'll see in America is 1827, the Democratic Party, the same party that exists today. So 1827, and then in 1832, the Whig Party forms in opposition. And then in 1854, the Republicans take over from the Whigs. And that's where, so in the first 50 years of American history, we don't have anything that you and I would recognize as a political party. There are groups and there are movements, but they're not parties in the way that we think of now, where they control a caucus and they control who gets elected. Those kinds of things, they just didn't exist at all. So we went about 50 years, a little over 50 years, without parties. About 51 years without them. So, good. Okay, great. All right, well, I want to jump to something kind of wild. I love this, and I hope you guys will like it too. And you know, especially, let me have you guys. You should have all had Great Books 1 and 2 at this point, right? How many of you've read? Well, I don't want to give it away yet. I'll just read this and then I'll ask you in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to April 29th of 1839. You guys don't need to write that date down, but I'm going to jump back to April 29th of 1839. It is the night before the 50th anniversary on which George Washington took the oath of office. And the federal government at that point, so it would have been April 30th of 1789, that Washington takes the oath of office, and he does so in the city building of New York, because that's where the Capitol was originally before it went to Washington, D.C. It was in New York City. And so Washington makes his trip up to New York and he takes his inaugural. But this is the 50th anniversary of that. George Washington's long, long dead at this point. But a man who had known Washington very well, John Quincy Adams, gives an oration on this 50th anniversary. And it's a beautiful oration. It's called the Jubilee. And it's an abolitionist oration. It's a very pro-Constitution oration. It's attacking John C. Calhoun, who's the leading Southerner at the time. But at the beginning of the oration, it's a 72-page oration. Adams went on for about 4 to 5 hours in this speech. I'm not going to read all of that. I'm just going to read the very introduction of the speech. But Quincy Adams mythologizes Washington. And I think that of all of our people in American history, Washington definitely deserved to be mythologized. If he isn't worth mythologizing, nobody in American history is. But he and Lincoln both deserve a kind of mythology around them. So this is what John Quincy Adams says. So I don't want you guys writing anything down right now. Just listen to the oratory here for a moment. And Quincy Adams was a great speaker, a really great speaker. So he could just spellbind an audience even for 5 hours. Here's how he begins. Would it be an unlicensed trespass of the imagination to conceive that on the night preceding the day of which you now commemorate the 50th anniversary, on the night preceding the 30th of April, 1789, when from the balcony of your city hall the Chancellor of the State of New York administered to George Washington the solemn oath faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States, and to the best of his ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Okay, total boilerplate at this point. We know Washington's going to take the oath of office. He's going to take it to the Constitution, which has never been done before. He's the first to do that. And so he's going to give this oath to the Constitution, and then he'll start the presidency. But now it gets really weird. That in the visions of the night, the guardian angel of the father of our country had appeared before him in the venerated form of his mother, and to cheer and encourage him in the performance of the momentous and solemn duties that he was about to assume, had delivered to him a suit of celestial armor, a helmet consisting of the principles of piety, of justice, of honor, of benevolence, with which from his earliest infancy he had hitherto walked through life in the presence of all of his brethren. A spear studded with the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence written upon it. A sword, the same with which he had led the armies of his country through the War of Freedom to the summit of the Arc of Independence. A corselet of long experience in habitual intercourse in peace and war with the world of mankind, his contemporaries of the human race in all their stages of civilization. And last of all, the Constitution of the United States, a shield embossed by heavenly hands with the future history of its country written upon it. Okay, it's pretty wild. The guardian angel of the father of our country appeared as his mother, and in the night before he took the oath of office, gave to him a suit of celestial armor. What do you guys notice about this? Let's just talk about it for a moment. Let's just think about what Quincy Adams is expecting of his audience. Yeah, Chris? Yeah, thanks.
Remind me of the Iliad. When I kill this guy's armor.
Yep, very, very good. And not just the Iliad, but also the Aeneid, right? It's the same story. And the Aeneid is much closer. It's much more proto-Christian than what we see in the Iliad. But Chris, it's awesome. So think about what Quincy Adams is expecting his audience to know. He's expecting that they know the Iliad and that they know the Aeneid. Okay, let's just shelve that for a moment. Let me just read to you. This is one of my favorite passages in all of literature. And since Chris brought this up, I want to read it. So this is the Shield of Aeneas, Book 8 of the Aeneid. But the goddess Venus, very important, it's Venus, it's the goddess of love. But the goddess Venus, lustrous among the cloud banks, bearing her gifts, approached, and when she spotted her son alone, off in a glade's recess by the frigid stream, she hailed him, suddenly there before him. Look, just forged to perfection by my husband's skill. Her husband, by the way, is Vulcan, the god of iron. By my husband's skill, the gifts that I promised. There's no need now, my son, to flinch from fighting swaggering Latin ranks or challenging savage Turnus to a duel. And with that, Venus reached and embraced her son. Turns out that Aeneas is a demigod, right? He's the son of a goddess. With that, Venus reached to embrace her son, and she set the armor next to him under a nearby oak tree. Aeneas takes delight in it, in the goddess's gifts and the honor of it all. As he runs his eyes across them piece by piece, he cannot get enough of them. He is filled with wonder. He turns them over, now with his hands, now with his arms. The terrible crested helmet, plumed and shooting fire, the sword blade honed to kill, the breastplate solid bronze, blood red and immense, like a dark blue cloud inflamed by the sun's rays and gleaming through the heavens, and the burnished greaves of electrum, smelted gold. But it was the spear and the shield, the workmanship of that shield. No words could ever describe its power, for there upon the shield was the whole story of Italy, Rome in all of her triumphs. For there Vulcan had forged them, for he was well aware of the seers, and he was schooled in times to come, and he saw all in order, the generations born, and all the wars that they would wage, and it was glorious. All right. almost word for word, almost, what is Quincy Adams doing to George Washington? We don't take this literally, do we? That his mother appeared to him like the goddess Venus? What's he doing to Washington? What does Washington become at the end of Quincy Adams' speech? Yeah, what's your name?
Katie.
Katie.
An epic hero.
Yeah, he's an epic hero. He's a demigod, right? In all kinds of ways. His mother has appeared to him. Okay, well, let's take this a little bit further. Let's go outside of paganism for a moment and think about Christianity. Who does John Quincy Adams sound like in Christianity? Anybody? Think about your scripture, your New Testament. Yeah?
Quincy Adams kind of sounds like Paul when he says, like, take up the full armor of God.
Yeah. Thank you. What's your name?
Luke.
Luke. Absolutely. Right. This is Ephesians 6 right here. Here it is. Finally, brethren, be strengthened in the Lord and in the might of his power. Put you on the armor of God that you may be able to stand against the deceits of the devil. For our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of this world of darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places. Therefore, take unto you the armor of God, that you may be able to resist in the evil day and to stand in all things perfect. Stand therefore your loins girt about with truth, having on the breastplate of justice, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. In all things taking the shield of faith, wherewith you may be able to extinguish all the fiery darts of the most wicked one, and take unto you the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit. Okay, so here we are at a place like Hillsdale. And think about what we believe in. And you guys probably aren't jaded by this yet as sophomores, but you will be by the time you're seniors. Think about what we say at Hillsdale. We believe in the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian inheritance of America, and America as an experiment of liberty under law. Right? That's our mission statement right there. Well, we have the Greco-Roman, we have the Iliad, and we have the Aeneid, and we have the Judeo-Christian. We have Ephesians. In other words, what John Quincy Adams has done is he has not only made a demigod out of George Washington, he has made him a Christian hero as well. And both of those things come together as a symbol for America. And I want you guys to know this. I think this is so important. There was no greater figure in his day and age than George Washington. Nobody came close. Everybody. This was not uncommon for what Quincy Adams did. Everybody thought that George Washington was a demigod. Everybody. Not literally, but mythologically they did. Symbolically, they understood that a man like Washington could only be born every few generations. He was as great as anybody in world history outside of Jesus. He was as great as Socrates. He was as great as Cicero. He was as great as Alexander the Great. Better, of course, than Alexander the Great. But that he was in the line, the pantheon of these heroes. And Washington knew that about himself, too. He was very humble about this. But he knew that he was respected in this way as well. And you guys, please know, all right, I'm straight. I have 7 kids. I don't want to sound like I'm not any of those things. But I think if I ever had a man crush, it would be on Washington. And this is what, when we read about him at the time, he was definitely considered the best looking guy of his generation. And especially when he was on horseback. And he was 6'2", and I love this story. One of my favorite stories about Washington. If you guys have ever seen pictures of John Adams, poor John was not a good-looking guy at all. He was short. He was always overweight. He sweated a lot. And yet he's married to this beautiful woman, Abigail. And John was always very insecure about his looks because he knew Abigail was like 1,000 times better looking than he was. And there's this moment where Abigail meets George Washington for the first time, and she turns to John and she says, "Oh, John, You didn't tell me the half of how handsome he is. You can just imagine poor John just deflated at that moment. But anyway, so I just want you guys to recognize this, that Washington really did have a presence about him. And he was 6'2". It's about 6 inches taller than the average man at the time. I know 6'2" is no big deal now, but it definitely was in the 18th century. So, he looked, if you guys have seen, like Dr. Kalthoff walking around, that's how he would have appeared. Or Dr. Kaspar as well, right? These kind of very tall guys. So that's how he would have appeared at the time, as just kind of a giant among men. Okay, so what do I mean by this then? Let's break this down a little bit, because I don't want to get too airy about all of this, but I want us to think about Washington as an incredible figure. So Washington, remember, is the least classically educated of all the founders. But here I want to take just a detour for a moment, and then I'm going to tell you guys a story, and we'll end today. But I'm going to take maybe a 5-minute detour just to talk about education at the time. So remember, Washington he's very educated, but he's educated in mathematics, engineering, surveying, and the military arts. He is not educated in Greek and Latin. And Greek and Latin is, from the standpoint of the 18th century, the only form of education there really is. So if Washington is educated in, say, surveying, what that means is he has been trained in their language. He has not been educated. He has been trained. And you could apply that today, and you guys know this isn't my viewpoint. It's just the way they would have thought about it in the 18th century. If you go on, for example, to law school after college, you're not being educated, you're being trained. If you go off into engineering after grad school, after undergrad into grad school, you're not being educated, you're being trained. If you go on in business, you're being trained. So education in the 18th century meant only the classics. So if I say you're educated, it means you know the classics. That's what education meant at the time. And this is pretty astounding, I think, for any of us in this room, because most of us can't do this. I can't do this. So I'm talking about things I'm not capable of doing. But if you look, let's say that you're a New England kid and you're a farm kid, but your parents want you to have a little bit of education. So they send you to school, say ages 8 through 10. By 10, you're a good worker on the farm, so you're not going to continue your education. But 8, 9, 10, you're still a little kid. You can go get educated. All you would learn, the only thing you would learn as an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, or a 10-year-old was Greek and Latin. That's all it was in the schools. The schools were nothing but drilling you in Greek and Latin. Things that we believe schools are for, reading, writing, and arithmetic, that was all stuff you learned at home and you didn't waste on public education. Public education was to teach you Greek and Latin. And so when we look at America, and I do want you guys to write some of this down, but when we look at America, there are only 9 colleges in America at the time of the founding. The Ivy League schools, and then William and Mary. And I still, to this day, I don't know why William and Mary isn't regarded as an Ivy League school, because it's just as old, but for whatever reason, it's not. So you've got the Ivy League schools like Harvard and Yale, King's College, which is now Columbia, those kinds of schools, Princeton, and then you have William and Mary. And the education of a young man in the 18th century, and it was only men. You guys know this, right? Women did not get an education until Hillsdale opened in 1844. We're the first college to allow women a liberal arts education. So it's not until 1844 that women can go to college in America. If you were Catholic, you could have gone to college in Europe, but you can't in America. And so it's not till 1844. So we're talking about young men. When you go to college, you go from ages 14 to 17 at the time in the 18th century. So 14 to 17 is when you go to college. These are the entrance requirements for all 9 colleges. You guys ready for this? So, no SAT, no ACT, no classical learning test. What you would have to do is this. You would be given the first 3 of Cicero's famous orations in Latin, and you would have to translate them to Greek. Then you would be given the first 3 books of the Gospel of John in Greek, and you would have to translate that to Latin. And then, and this is the shocking one, you would be given the first 1,500 lines of Virgil's Aeneid, and you would have to translate that from Latin to English. 1,500 lines of poetry. That's amazing. And then all the college requirements said you must have a blameless moral character as well. Well, if you're a 14-year-old male and you're totally fluent in Greek and Latin, you probably haven't gotten into too much trouble at that point. But do you guys see what a different world this is from ours? And so is it surprising that John Quincy Adams would give a speech about the Aeneid that he would expect everybody to know? Because it was just part of the culture. And so when we think about the American founding, we're going to completely mess up unless we understand that the American founding is the rebirth of Rome. That's what the American founding is. It is the rebirth of Rome. And these guys knew their Romans. They loved their Romans. They loved Cicero. They loved Tacitus. They knew their Romans inside and out. And, just to give you, I love this, one of my favorite examples, and then I've got a story to tell you guys, but one of my favorite examples, at the Battle of Yorktown, the great Revolutionary War battle, right? There was no greater battle than Yorktown. Yorktown was the end of the British in North America. But when we fought the British at Yorktown, this was the fall of 1781, when we fought them, 2/3 of our forces were French. So it was only 1/3 American and 2/3 French, and we were able to defeat the British. But this is what's astounding to me. None of the French spoke English, and none of the Americans spoke French. And so all the battlefield orders on that day at Yorktown were in Latin. It was the only language they had in common. Can you imagine yelling in Latin as you go into battle? That's incredible. But that's a different world from what we live in every way. And like I said, I can't do this. My Latin is terrible and my Greek is non-existent, and I certainly don't know Hebrew. So, I have nothing for what these guys are doing. You probably are all better off than I am about that. But really incredible just to imagine that and how important that was. Okay, you see how significant that was for these people. Okay, last story. If you guys get a chance, go over to the statue of George Washington. He's 56 in the statue that we have over here. And just look at how mythic he is. All right, so I'm 58. I'm 2 years older than Washington was in that statue. And I clearly don't have that kind of charisma or any of the physical build or anything. That I'm the same height, but that's it. All right, so there you've got Washington. And just check him out. Just go over there, look at him. Get a kind of sense of what a demigod he is in the way that he's being portrayed there. But I love Washington because Washington is a true Republican in the sense that he always believes it's his duty to fight, but the moment he's done fighting, he wants to go home. And so let me just tell you a couple of things about him. Washington had many titles. He was the American Aeneas. Everybody called him that. He was also the American Achilles. And the reason he was the American Achilles is because he would go into battle and his men would have to restrain him because he would need to be at the back of the lines directing the battle, but he would get so excited. He loved battle that he would run up to the front lines as the general, and not exaggerating, his men would tackle him and drag him back to the rear of the lines. But Washington was in so many firefights that there were times that his clothing was shredded off his body because of the bullets just ripping in to what he was wearing. And yet not once in his whole life did a bullet ever graze his skin. Not once. So think about how close they came. So he's the American Achilles. But he's also the American Cincinnatus. Cincinnati, the town in Ohio, is named after him. Cincinnatus, you guys may know, Cincinnatus is a mythic figure in Roman history. And the story of Rome was this. Every time there would be war or someone would besiege Rome, Rome would suspend its republican constitution for a brief amount of time. It would elect a dictator and give to that dictator absolute power to stop the crisis. But it was always expected that at the end of that conflict, everything would go back to normal and we'd reestablish the republican constitution. The story is that Cincinnatus was called forth by his people to be dictator. And they gave him something, and I'm making this up, I can't remember how long, but they gave him something like 3 months to solve the crisis. And he's such a good leader that he solves it within 3 weeks. And the people of Rome are so astounded by this guy that they elect him dictator for life and suspend the republic. And so we don't know if this is true or not, but it's a great story. And so what Cincinnatus does is he calls all of Rome together in the Forum. He brings all of the Romans there, and he has with him his plow and he has his sword. This is where it's mythic. You can't imagine him walking into Rome with his huge plow, but he has his plow there. And he looks at the people and he says, I am so disgusted by you. Anyone who would give up liberty for tyranny is not worthy of me or any republic. And he spits on them, and then he takes his sword and he throws it on the ground. And he says, leave me alone for the rest of my life. I'm going to go be a farmer. And he picks up his plow, he walks off, he's gone. Nobody ever sees him again. Well, Washington loved that story, absolutely loved it. So here's the last story I want to tell you guys today. I don't think we'll go over, but it'll be close. Okay. In 1781, we have the last battle at Yorktown. But we don't sign the treaty with Britain until the summer of 1783, 2 years later. And what that means is that neither army on American soil can disband. The British army has to stay, even though they've been defeated. They have to camp and stay for 2 years waiting for orders from England. And the Americans can't allow a British army to stay on our soil without a counter army. So they all go up to Newburgh, New York, where West Point is. And that's why West Point is where it is. They go up there and they camp. And so for 2 years, you've got these opposing armies. They're not fighting. They're just both waiting. But our army, our American army, is getting really, really frustrated because they're just sitting there. And the only mistake Washington ever made in his public life was that he left his army and went home to Martha, which is all he ever wanted to do. He just wanted to be with Martha and farm. And so he's not with his men as his men are getting agitated. By the fall of 1782, a year after Yorktown, by the fall of 1782, the men of the army are so restless, they're openly calling for a march on Congress to disband it, to end the American Republic, and to name George Washington as dictator of America. And that increases all through the winter of 1782, 1783. They're open about it, totally open. And so Washington, as soon as the first thaw comes in Virginia, he gets on his white horse and he rides as fast as he can up to Newburgh, New York. And he calls all of his men together, not accidentally, on March 15th of 1783. You guys know what's that date? What's March 15th? Ides of March. Who was killed on the Ides of March? Caesar, right? This is all intentional. So Washington calls all of his men together and he gives the greatest speech he's ever given. He's never come close to this kind of oratory. It's just brilliant. And tells these men, live up to what the Republic is about. Live up to the revolution. Don't let your comrades have died in vain. We will not create a dictatorship. We will maintain liberty. And he finishes and he looks out at his men and they're all just staring back at him blank-faced. Nobody has been moved by Washington at all. And now you have to really put yourself into the time period. One of the things that was completely unacceptable for a male in the 18th century was to ever show any sign of weakness. So let's say I have the flu today. I'm in good health. But let's say I have the flu. And Leon says, Dr. Berzer, are you okay? Well, the last thing I could do is say, oh, yeah, I've got the flu. I would have to say, oh, yeah, I'm fine, Leon. I'm fine. Are you sure, sir? Yeah, I'm fine. That's what you have to do. And one of the things, and we would have been in trouble, one of the things men could not do publicly was wear eyeglasses. That was seen as a show of weakness, and it was seen as effeminate to do. And so Washington finishes his speech, and he reaches into his pocket, and he says to his men, you must forgive me. I have not only grown gray in the service of my country, but I've grown blind. And he puts his eyeglasses on in front of everybody. And I'm not exaggerating. Every guy in the room breaks down weeping at that point. That's Washington's power, the incredible moment, and he breaks the coup. Now just think about this, guys. George Washington turned down the dictatorship of America. That's incredible. Why? Because he knew his mythology. Myth matters. It may not be true, but man, does it matter so much. And really, all of us in this room should thank God Washington was our first president. Okay, thank you guys. So I will see you, no new readings. I will see you on Wednesday, and we're going to get into the Constitution.